I'm very happy to introduce another guest familiar to us, Betsy Dexter-Dyer. She's here to do another one of her excellent programs. This one is called George Washington Had a Drink Here, and it's about the history of the Revolutionary War in Walpole. Thank you, Betsy.
You're welcome. Yeah, it was the possibility that George Washington had a drink of water here that got me into this topic. And then I thought, oh, this is a perfect topic for Walpole's 300th anniversary. So it will also be about Walpole in the Revolutionary War. I can't stretch an entire hour out of someone having a drink of water, but I will make, but I'm gonna make a huge deal out of it. You will see. All right, so it begins here at the Walpole Historical Society. If you have not been to the society, I would suggest you go. 300th anniversary is a great year to get introduced to that place. Here's one of our decorated parlors, and here's beautiful spiral staircase. If you're interested in carpentry and want to see an original handmade spiral staircase going up to our second floor, that's worth seeing, I think. And up on the landing of the second floor is a strange little display. I have to say the Walpole Historical Society is an eclectic place. All sorts of odds and ends for you to see and connect or not connect to Walpole history. This always seemed a little odd to me. It's a gourd. Yeah. And there's a little label on it. A dipper, gourd dipper, probably hung at the well to drink from, probably like the one Zilpha Boyden gave George Washington a drink from. And ever since I've been an active member of the society, I've seen that and thought, could it be true? Where does this even come from? And of course, it's not the original gourd. And is there anything about this that I could pursue? And it turned out that there was, and I could make a story out of it. All right, so who, what, when, where, how, and why. Some of these are going to be answered because it is about the Revolutionary War, and we have a pretty good record, especially of George Washington's whereabouts. Once he became an important person, he's in people's journals, he's in his own journals and records, and so we pretty much know where he was. We know that he was taking a trip south from Boston after the British had left Boston. That was his why for that particular trip. We know it was April 5th, 1776, and we know he was traveling with an entourage of men and horses and equipment and everything else because they were leaving Boston to go on to other important battlegrounds in the Revolutionary War. This was just the beginning. But I had plenty of questions that I needed to address. What route would he have taken heading out of Boston? Of course, I hoped that it would take him through Walpole, but I needed to ascertain that. Did it take him through Walpole? And why that particular route? Were there choices for him? And so was there something about going through Walpole? I kind of hoped there was. I'm not sure if I can really prove that, but we'll see. And who was this Zilpha Boyden? And why was she along the road that day? Did she know that George Washington was coming along? Needed to answer that. So stay tuned to see how I answer all of these things. Little by little, I'm going to put it together against the background of Walpole and the Revolutionary War. All right, but it begins back here, and we had a really great relationship with England. We named our town 300 years ago after the first Prime Minister of England, Robert Walpole. And in fact, in the fall, there will be a Friends of the Library lecture just on that topic. Who is this prime minister that we were so enamored of? And it wasn't just us. There's a Walpole, New Hampshire as well. And there are some other Walpoles around the United States. So this was somebody that we want to know more about, and you can find out in the fall at a Friends of the Library lecture. Among other things, and this is way too brief, he wanted less power to the king, and he was sympathetic to the colonies. Why he was sympathetic, you'll have to find out later, because that would be too much of a digression. But he had some concerns about the colonies that were appealing to us. That was then. This is now. We're already into trouble. 1765, something called the quartering of British troops began. And now I want you to notice that this is done by a 19th century artist. See his bracket dates, Howard Pyle. So this is a little bit revisionist history. We're supposed to see these wonderful colonial ladies on the left side, patient and wonderful ladies in these awful, obnoxious redcoats who have taken over their dining room and eating their food, drinking the wine. That's the quartering of British troops that began, in which supposedly, and mostly in the Boston area, British officers especially could go into someone's home and enjoy some food and drink. Outrageous. All right, Walpole's response. We sent Joshua Clapp to have a discussion about it at Faneuil Hall. And we sent up Seth King to represent the General Court, which at that time was not even held in Boston because of the riots that were going on, because of things like the quartering of the British troops. It was being held at Harvard at that time. So that's our response, and throughout this, I will tell you a general thing that was happening, and then Walpole's response, so you can get a feeling for what we were doing in the Revolutionary War, especially when it was in this area. All right, Faneuil Hall, take a look at that architecture. See the arched windows, or the arched doors at the bottom, the arched windows, the cupola at the top, and of course this is supposedly back in 1775, artist conception. Remarkably similar today. Of course, it's surrounded by skyscrapers, but they've done a pretty good job of keeping a lot of the architecture, the arched doorways, the arched windows. You can see they've added a story to it. There's still a nice cupola there. So Faneuil Hall, where some important meetings took place. 1773, the next outrage, or at least the next outrage I'm going to tell you about, a new tea tax, and the beginning of the classic taxation without representation. And Walpole's response was to have a special town meeting about the rights and liberties being infringed upon and to show our solidarity with other towns. And we also built a powder house. And I'll tell you quite a bit about what I know about that powder house. It was on Powder House Hill. Now, my electronic pointer doesn't work, but on this map, can you see Powder House Hill? Now, see where the railroad tracks are crossing in town? This is an 1876 map. This is not Revolutionary War. We don't have any railroad in the Revolutionary War. But this is going to orient you. This is today where the train station is. Here's Powder House Hill, and it was still being called Powder House Hill 100 years later, because that was the most distinctive thing about it. Let me show you a little bit more about it. Whoops. All right, there we go. It was high. 1897, here's a view from Powder House Hill. Now, I'm going to label things in just a bit, but see if you can spot something. Isn't that the old town hall there? And that's the Episcopal Church. Of course, this is 1897, right? So it was quite a hill. And you're thinking to yourself, if you know Walpole, where was this hill where I could look out and gaze at the town hall? Not to mention looking at what would be the Boston skyline out there, if there was a Boston skyline. It's quite a view, wasn't it? And you can see the train down below. Labeled a few things for you. So, indeed, that's Town Hall. That's the United Church. There's the Episcopal Church. Lewis Pond today is not so substantial. We still have something called Lewis Pond, completely surrounded by trees. You're not going to get a good view of it, and quite silted in. And the Lewis Batting Company, which later became the Kendall Company. All right, just to get you oriented as to where this is. But you're still kind of wondering, where is this? It's the homes at Swan Pond. Who here lives at Swan Pond? So you live at the site of the former Powder House Hill. It was a huge pile of gravel left by the glacier, and we have a few of those in town, but not all that many left because gravel is valuable. And so little by little, the hill was taken down and taken down and taken down until it was down to ground level and then a little lower. That's how come you got the ponds. If you're going to take it down below ground level, then you're going to have some ponds to handle the runoff in rainstorms. So homes at Swan Pond, you live at Powder House Hill, once a substantial hill. Does everyone know where that is, by the way? Okay, so because there are some Spring Street, Main Street, railroad tracks up there. All right, now usually powder houses are fairly substantial, especially if they're in a major city or major town, especially close to Boston during the Revolutionary War. So here's a powder house of a fairly typical design, apparently, that still stands in Somerville, Mass. And Somerville, Mass would be, of course, right close to the Boston action. Round, and my understanding is there are a couple of reasons for the powder houses to be round. One is that it's cheaper to make a round building, and people would have to contribute materials, and you just have to contribute fewer stones or bricks or whatever you're building it with if you make it round. And also, if there's an explosion in a rounded powder house, supposedly the lack of corners means it will be more contained and less dangerous. So if there's a structural engineer, he or she can correct me at the end if I've got that wrong. All right. Oh, but I'm going to say Walpole's was square, and it was about 6 foot square. Okay, so it wasn't looking like this. It was looking more like your garden shed. All right, so think a little shed in the garden way on top of Powder House Hill, not a substantial rounded tower like this, and it's long gone, of course. All right, more trouble with the British. It was called the destruction of the tea. I got corrected on this by someone who knows his Revolutionary War history. We now call it the Boston Tea Party. That was more of a 19th century into 20th century title for it, but it was originally called the destruction of the tea. And in contrast to the way it's usually talked about, it was quiet, it was quick, and it was at night. So again, we have another artist reconstruction, making it look like it's happening in broad daylight with a huge crowd and a great deal of fanfare and noise. But in fact, quiet, quick, and at night, dumping some tea overboard to protest the taxes on tea, the outrageous taxes on tea. This was a Courier print from 1846, so revisionist. Then come the coercive acts, and again, I was corrected on this. We now call them the intolerable acts. That was a later epithet for them. 1774, they were called the coercive acts. This is not a complete list of them, but let's look at the outrages here. The closing of Boston Harbor, and that's anything at all that we get as an import coming into our area is going to be coming through Boston Harbor. No more local governments. British officials who commit crimes can be sent back to England, where presumably they're not going to get the kind of fair trial that they deserve, and more of this British troops taking over other people's buildings. Now, some of this is going to affect Walpole, not all of it. I can say that there was no British troops at all interested in coming to Walpole and taking over anyone's building. A little tiny subsistence farming town with a very small population, so most of this was happening in the Boston area. However, indirect effects on us, and we certainly were in solidarity with other towns closer to Boston. Our response, we bought more gunpowder, more bullets, and we ordered some flints. So we're getting ready. Remember, we've got a little powder house on top of Powder House Hill. We're loading that up with extra munitions that we're going to be needing. All right. Town meetings were prohibited, effective August 1st, 1774. What an outrage. What was Walpole's response? We held a town meeting August 29th, 1774. Good for us, right? At the first meeting house on the Common. Now, in those days, the meeting house for town meeting was one and the same thing as the church. It was one church in town at that time, and it was also where town meetings happened. So meeting house, literally, but also meeting houses is another word sometimes for a church. And we decided to send some delegates to an important meeting in Dedham. Here is, again, one more artist idea about what this meeting house looked like, and I'll show you where it was in just a minute if you're not sure. This is probably much bigger than the meeting house that was actually there. This is a 3-story building with a full attic, and it was not that big, but there's our first meeting house, and it is where this cross is on the Common But here's how you orient yourself. That's Santa Claus's house on the common, and there's the Episcopal Church. So some of you have seen this before. Others can easily find it now. You simply go to Santa Claus's house. That's the site. So you can envision this now, the site where town meetings were taking place, and also any kind of public worship in town was taking place. Everybody was some version of a Congregationalist Protestant in town. Ooh, oh dear. All right, let me just make sure I didn't mess up. No, we're good. All right, so where was this meeting? This meeting was to take place up in Dedham, the site of the present day Registry of Deeds, if you can envision that, okay? It was to take place at a tavern. Another popular meeting place would be a tavern. Now, I want to sort out names of taverns a little bit. This took me a little bit as well. You might be saying, well, I'll go look up Woodward Tavern and find out more about it. You often have to look up a tavern under several names. Fisher's, Ames Tavern, same thing. They were named for the proprietor or the tavern keeper of the time. They didn't have a name that stood alone for generation after generations. So if you're trying to keep track of where things are going on, be aware that you're going to have different tavern keepers, and their names will be on them. Out of this came something called the Suffolk Resolves. So we had a representative for that. Very important. Here's what that tavern may have looked like. Again, think center of Dedham with the courthouse and the Registry of Deeds. So at this time, it was just a little country place. But on the Norfolk County Registry of Deeds is a plaque. That's how important the Suffolk Resolves were. Here met on September 6, 1774, the convention which 3 days later at Milton adopted the Suffolk Resolves. And then here's the quote: "They lighted the match that kindled the mighty conflagration of the American Revolution." Began in Dedham, according to this plaque anyway. So take a look at that if you're up there. First, you got to park your car. That would be non-trivial. But if you can manage to park your car, you can stop and look at this. And briefly, here are the Suffolk Resolves. We are to boycott British goods. We are to tell the British leaders they've got to resign. We stop paying taxes. That probably went over pretty well in a small town like this. Well, yeah, sure, we'll stop paying. We're to support our own government, colonial government, and we're to raise a militia. All right, so 1774, we sent money or raised money to support the Continental Congress. We did not send anyone, but we did send Enoch Ellis to the Provincial Congress in Salem, even though it was forbidden. Remember, we're not supposed to be gathering and congregating or doing any of that. Forbidden by whom? Forbidden by General Thomas Gage, the new governor of Massachusetts. This is Michael LePage. His usual job is to reenact Paul Revere up at the Paul Revere House and John Quincy Adams at the Adams House. So he's a professional reenactor. If you go into the Paul Revere House, he'll be the one. But now and then he'll do a Tory. And so this is him pretending to be British General Thomas Gage, looking very fierce, forbidding the meeting, and we're having it anyway. All right, so we are to withhold tax money, we're to stop consuming goods from England, and here's the crucial thing: we are to appoint inspectors to make sure the boycott happens, because boycotts can be hard to enforce. If you ever live through the boycotting of lettuce or the boycotting of tomatoes or the boycotting of a certain store that we're not supposed to go to, it can be really hard to enforce those, right? So in Walpole, we had a population of 800. We needed 16 inspectors, apparently, just to keep people from using some of the goods they weren't supposed to be using. Because it's difficult. I'll show you what those goods were, and you can see, you can have a little sympathy for them and why you might need inspectors to enforce it. Glass, paper, lead, and the lead would be for bullets. So no more lead coming in to be melted down to make bullets. They had to use other material. They had some bog iron they could use, but no more of lead. Paint, and then tea. And there are other things on the list as well. So we had inspectors going around making sure people were not bringing those down from Boston, which is where they'd be coming from. All right, so we began to deliver firewood to Boston to support the poor people up there that had the port closed. And here comes one of our really famous quotations from Walpole for the Revolutionary War. Philip Robbins was on his way up to Boston, going tavern by tavern, and I'll explain that tavern to tavern thing in just a bit. If you were going to Boston, you'd be glad to get to your next tavern because you're going on a dusty dirt road, and your next tavern is a place to water your horses, get a little drink and food for yourself. So he was in a tavern. He said some traitorous things, and he was, for a short time, held prisoner. And he said, "Americans will fight better without officers than your men with officers." That's our big quote for the Revolutionary War. Right there, Philip Robinson. All right, so we begin to organize our Minutemen, and I want to say something about them. Oh, well, here, for example, are some of our Minutemen. These are reenactors of the Minutemen at the Walpole Historical Society. Next time we say we have reenactors coming for the Minutemen, come on down and have a look, because what they did was they loaded up these muskets and they went across the street to the common and they fired them off every hour. Really kind of spectacular. They would be marching in formation. By the way, they're supposed to look like a motley group. They're not supposed to have a uniform that matches everyone else's uniform. These are just farmers from town, or reenactors in this case of farmers from town. And we know exactly who served and for how long. We have a list of everybody's service, alphabetical. So if you think you've got an ancestor who may have served and you want to know exactly how long and exactly where, come to the Walpole Historical Society. It's a very easy lookup. But there's a reason that we have such a good list. It's because these guys had to get paid. And that was pretty controversial. Every town had to come up with some money via voting in taxes. Always controversial, right? Imagine that town meeting. Certain amount of money to pay our militiamen per day, okay? And so we needed to keep track of exactly who was getting that money. As you might imagine, even after the war, they were still trying to sort it out. People would say, I've served for 3 days here, 5 days there, I deserve such and such money. At first, they were getting 2 shillings per day paid by Walpole, but Walpole only appropriated 20 pounds for that. Oh, that's interesting. Sorry. This is magnetic, and it's attached to my... All right. Only appropriated 20 pounds. There are 20 shillings to a pound. You do a little math there. You're not going to be lasting the war. You're not going to have enough people to send up to Boston for any more than a few days with that kind of payment. But that just shows you how controversial this was. We don't want to raise thousands and thousands of pounds for this. Who knows how long this is going to last? Well, people didn't want to sign up for that. So a few months later, it was up to 4 shillings. And then there's this problem. Here's a 4 shilling note. So at that time, the paper currency was kind of unstable. We were already on a rocky relationship with England from where the currency originated. And so did you want to get paid with a little paper 4 shilling note? Well, maybe you were. And then that wasn't enough. So if you did out-of-state service, you would be up to monthly payments. Finally, it was up to 14 pounds per person just to get them to enlist. And the town had to borrow money to make that happen. Can you imagine those town meetings, right? And then at various points, there were attempts to say, look, wouldn't you rather have some rye and some pork and some butter than some pound notes? And on and on and on. So if you would like to read a lot about this controversy, see a wonderful book by Isaac Newton Lewis. I highly recommend it. He's got an entire chapter just on the tribulations of trying to pay the Minutemen, and kept upping the ante and trying to sort out who was getting what. All right, so we're getting close to an important date. In fact, we're right at an important date here. April 19th, 1775, 3 of our guys, Robbins, Smith, and Boyden, are taking some firewood up, and they found out the Minutemen had been called to Lexington. Now you think, how do they find out? Well, word of mouth, that was it. I mean, they were going from tavern to tavern to tavern. Other people had been tavern to tavern to tavern. That's where you got the news. And by the way, back to Zilpha Boyden, I really am going to get totally back to her in just a bit. Smith and Boyden both have connections to Zilpha. We're going to get all of Zilpha's connections. We're going to find out she was extremely well connected in town, which isn't saying much. There's only 600 people in town. You could be well connected too if there are only 600. So the three of them rode home quickly and put together a huge company, 64 Minutemen, 67 other men, and 29 people from a collaboration we had with Medfield, total of 160. Compare that to the population of our town. It's pretty much every able-bodied man in town headed up there. And this is a subsistence farming town in the spring when they're supposed to be planting crops. They've got families on little farms here and there. Oh, and they arrived too late. Now, but before you think I'm making fun of them, you would have arrived too late too. If I said, look, everybody, we got to actually head up to Concord now. And by the way, you've got to have guns and equipment, and maybe you're going to be overnight for a few nights, and I need 160 of you, and we're hitting the road within like an hour. First thing was, what's the traffic going to be like? We're not going to get up there, right? So they're going on these little country roads with everything they think they need to stay for a period of time to participate in a battle. Of course they arrived too late. Everyone in a radius around Boston sent people and arrived too late. Who was there on time were people from Concord and from Lexington and from the very close by towns. All right, so they missed out on this. There is an artist idea of some of the first shots and the first people down. And here are reenactors. Every year we have reenactors up at Concord showing us what it might have looked like as they fired from behind the stone walls. No Walpole people there. And after a few days, because they actually did get there, they got there too late, most of them went home to tend to their businesses and their farms and their families. Of course they did, right? And that's really the story of the little booklet that we have that I can show you at the Historical Society. If you look up one of your ancestors, you'll say, he stayed for 3 days, he stayed for 5 days, 7 days, not much longer than that. They had to get home. But some of them stayed. It tended to be the younger men and the single men who stayed and had longer military careers, some of them actually months, even a couple of years at a time. The important thing that we participated in was something called the Siege of Boston, which I'm going to explain to you. It was about a year. Look at the bracket dates, April 19th, March 17th, for about a year. And this is important because Boston looks very, very different nowadays. Here's Boston. I'm going to put some additional labels on this in just a bit, don't worry. But this little pink thing here, surrounded by water, approachable just by a little isthmus here that was called Boston Neck, that's kind of it. That's Boston. Over here is going to be Cambridge and Charlestown, South Boston down there, not connected to Boston at that time, not called that. Okay, here we go with some labels. All right, Old North Church. Here's Charlestown. It too is kind of a peninsula approached by a little isthmus. Here's Back Bay, looking just like a bay, because it was. Here's Castle Island. Now, you've been to Castle Island, I'll bet, even on a COA trip. It was once an island. It's no longer an island. Here's Dorchester Heights. By the way, that's South Boston, okay, but they weren't calling it that. That's going to be important. Here's Roxbury down there. All right, so a very different look. And here's the fill that occurred. I'm going to actually do a little digression on the fill because it's an interesting little story we have from Walpole concerning that. But first of all, let me just get you oriented. Here's that little neck into Boston. Here's Back Bay all filled in. Here's Charlestown, the little neck, but oh, it's all filled in as well. Here's the Logan Airport that's stuck way out in the middle of the ocean. Wow, that was a lot of fill. And here's Castle Island. We know we can drive to it. and indeed we can, so it's no longer an island. Last year, we had a trip to the Netherlands, and I remember thinking to myself, my goodness, these people have built everything out into the ocean. They've just kind of taken over, filling the ocean. So did we, I would say. Boston is built on the ocean with a great deal of fill. Now, see what I wrote off to the side? When they were filling Back Bay, some of the fill came from Walpole. Yeah. Yep. Wonder where. Well, I looked into that. So, Powder House Hill. So I happen to know, because I studied the deeds, that around about 1895, this is toward the end of the filling of Back Bay, so they're already filling the fens. The fens had to get filled as well. A lot of things had to get filled up there. This stretch of land right here along West Street is right about where Powder House Hill was. And at that time, it was a hill, okay? But little by little in the 20th century, it's taken down and taken down and taken down. But this was sold to some folks up in Boston so that some of the gravel could be hauled away to Back Bay. So again, you people who are from Swan Pond, so where you live is famous for a couple of reasons. Some of the material from where you live is in Back Bay right now, probably toward the Fens area. All right, what can we see today? Well, Dorchester Heights, nothing but a monument surrounded by buildings in South Boston. But George Washington's headquarters were in Cambridge, and they're one and the same thing with the Longfellow House, which is at one of the National Historic Sites. You can tour this house. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow lived there after George Washington used it as headquarters, and it's a gorgeous building to look at. So George Washington was situated in Cambridge, but operating from Dorchester Heights. Doing what? Keeping the British in Boston. In fact, let me go back 3 slides. If you ran the British into Boston along this isthmus, they weren't coming out again unless you let them. So that's what the Siege of Boston is all about. They're stuck in here. And by the way, here's George Washington down here, keeping an eye on things, all right, when he's not back in Cambridge. All right. There he is, overlooking Boston. You can see all the churches of Boston, keeping an eye on the British, making sure that they're not getting enough food and firewood. And there was another call to get some Minutemen up there for the Siege of Boston to make sure that it happened. 20,000 Minutemen arrived into that area. Some of them came from Walpole, again, for days at a time, not weeks and months. But they arrived via Walpole. That's the exciting thing. And got refreshments at one of our taverns in Walpole that we know. Now, can you imagine 20,000 people walking through Walpole? How exciting. And it's no wonder that some of our younger men wanted to go along with them and did. And they got paid for it, so why wouldn't they? So now I get to talk about some taverns in Walpole. Many of them, and we know this from people's journals, got refreshments at something called Heddon's Tavern in Walpole. It gets spelled a number of different ways, so watch for that, okay? People didn't necessarily spell things uniformly in their journal. Now, let's get to Zilpha here in just a minute, or right now, actually. Some of Zilpha Boyden's relatives, David Boyden, Captain John Boyden, Joseph Boyden, these are her in-laws, this is her maternal relatives, the Hartshorns, were at Dorchester Heights for the siege for some days at a time. So Zilpha was connected to people who were doing important things at that particular point in the Revolutionary War. It's part of the reason that she probably knew something about what was going on when they all started to leave Boston. All right, so here they are at the end of the siege, getting ready to go. Somewhere in there is George Washington, yet more reenactors. And more people I just said getting ready to go up to Boston. Here they are assembling along the road, getting ready to go up to Boston, not coming back yet. And more people connected to Zilpha. Jeremiah Smith and John Boyden had companies of men, and these are Zilpha's relatives. Finally, fast forward to Evacuation Day, and it's why we call it Evacuation Day up in Boston, a holiday of sorts, also St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1776. George Washington is finally seeing the British leaving Boston by boat. See you later. And he heads into Boston triumphantly on Evacuation Day. We've restored it to the colonies. All right? So first victory of the war, but it's going to be a long war. There's going to be plenty going on south of us that we're not going to get into right now. All right, so people started to go home from Boston. The Minutemen started going home, and George Washington departed. And we know George Washington headed out because, again, he was important and famous, and people wrote it in their diaries exactly where he was. So we know that the night of April 4, 1776, he stayed overnight at someone's house in Dedham, and we know that April 5th, he headed south and went through Walpole and stayed overnight in North Wrentham in Norfolk, and I'll show you his route, because it's going to go tavern by tavern again. So I need to explain post roads. And I need to explain that we have 3 post roads in Walpole. 3. Not all towns have 3. Some towns have 0. Some have 1. We have 3. I'm going to put more labels on this in just a minute. I just want you to look at this to start with without labels. 1, 2, 3. The dots are going to represent taverns. I'm going to label those as well. This obviously is a current street map of Walpole, but we know enough about where these post roads are that you could travel along them yourself, if you know what streets they are, which I'll tell you. And our oldest post road is actually still called Old Post Road, circa 1690. It's also, if you know your Old Post Road area, Pleasant Street as well, because you know how Pleasant Street and Old Post kind of go into each other. And you also know that a great big golf course kind of got in the way as well. So you can't necessarily easily make the exact journey that people would have gone. But current day, you start up in Pleasant Street in East Walpole and you head down Old Post and you're on the original Post Road. And there's a tavern there. Is someone doubting me? No.
No, I was saying Washington Street, and that's all.
Oh, no, we're going to have Washington Street in a second.
Sorry.
But look, our next post road is circa 1750. This is going to be the one that we care about for this particular talk. It's going to do something funny. Here it is coming down Route 1A, doing what you'd expect, gets to the center of town, and then it does something bizarre. It takes this strange detour and heads out. I'll have to explain that, and I will. Then, after that was given up as a post road, we have a new modern post road, 1806. It's the straightest road in town. Zoom. East Walpole to straight down to South Walpole. That was designed and built as a modern post road. And so that's where our post road history ends once we're done with Washington Street. So the only one we're concerned about now for this talk is this post road. However, I know you want to see the names of the taverns. So Roebuck Tavern, no longer there, up in East Walpole, was the main tavern on the Old Post Road. And if we were to look for it today, it would be on Pleasant Street, approximately where I stuck it on the map there, but it's long gone. And I'm jumping right ahead to Washington Street here. Up in East Walpole, we had Morse Tavern. Where is it now? Torn down, but if you know the Triangle Building in East Walpole, that's the site of the old Morse Tavern. And then we had Polly and Fuller Taverns down in South Walpole. Polly Tavern, long gone, would be next to the Methodist Church. Fuller Tavern, now a private home. Okay, so taverns, very important on post roads. You would travel a certain distance and your horses needed watering and food and you needed some water and food. Then you'd go to your next one. So if you were writing in a journal about how you were traveling, you'd say, I get to this tavern, then I got to that tavern, then I get to you wouldn't say I was on a dusty, dirty road, for miles and miles. It would be tavern by tavern in your journal. And if I go to the one that we care about for this talk, we had Cheney's Tavern, then the Brass Ball, and I put the Brass Ball in parentheses because it wasn't quite functional as a tavern at the exact time of the Revolutionary War for a reason I'll explain to you. And then we have Hiddens, which turns out to be really important. That's the one I mentioned first. It was spelled a slightly different way. All right, so typical tavern by tavern trip in the 1770s. I would start up in Dedham at Ames Tavern. We already talked about Ames Tavern. That's the one that's near the courthouse and the Registry of Deeds. I would then come down through Dedham to what is today Norwood, but it wasn't Norwood at the time, to Ellis's Tavern, and I'll tell you where that was. Then I come down into Walpole to Cheney's, also sometimes called Downs. I would like to stop at the Brass Ball, but I can't because Ezekiel Robbins, the proprietor, had just died, and his widow didn't want to have a whole lot of troops coming through, and really kind of taking over the place. So we go all the way down to Hiddens, and then we get to North Wrentham. Now it's called Norfolk, okay? To Mann's Tavern, also comes by some different names. All right, this would be a typical journey that you'd see in someone's journal. Where are they now? All right, in red. I said Courthouse and Registry of Deeds. Norwood Common, okay, long gone, but it was pretty much on Norwood Common where you would expect it, right? 841 Main Street, I'll show you a picture of that, is Cheney's Tavern. The Brass Ball, put it in blue because it's not functional at this particular point, is where the Neponset crosses West Street, so it's down before you get to the S-curve on your way to the railroad station. And then Hiddens, 492 Lincoln Road. Yep. And then we get to the corner of Route 115 and Main Street in North Wrentham, and we're at Mann's Tavern. All right? So, for example, this is one account from a Minuteman coming through Walpole to Boston. This Minuteman said I had a little refreshment at Hiddens, that's on Lincoln Road. Then I had victuals and drinks at Dr. Cheney's, and then I went to Ellis's in Norwood. Well, he didn't say Norwood, he would say Dedham. Norwood didn't exist, all right? But actually lists those taverns, right? And by the way, would have passed this milestone. Now, this milestone was at the Brass Ball. It got moved relatively recently in the 19th and 20th century to Town Hall, Old Town Hall. You can see it on the lawn of Old Town Hall. But look, imagine you're passing this and it says you've got 20 more miles to go before you even get to Boston. You'd be looking for your next tavern for all kinds of good reasons. You're not going to make 20 miles in one day on these roads with all that equipment you're carrying. All right, here's another example. This is a Connecticut Minuteman. He said, I had breakfast at Mann's and Wrentham. Remember, that's current day Norfolk, okay? Think Norfolk Center with a little library and all. Then I had punch at Heads or Hedens, which is Hiddens. Trust me, they're spelling it in all kinds of fun ways. And then by the time they got to Cheney's, they had to cook the dinner for themselves. This was fairly typical. These are little taverns. Most of the rank and file men would be out in the yard tenting, building a fire, cooking their food. Maybe the officers would get to be inside for the night and get to have food. They couldn't handle hundreds of men at once. So some of them would be outside in the yard cooking food for themselves. All right, another example, and look who this is. This is Lieutenant Nathan Hale. He's only 20 years old. Next year, when he's 21, he's going to be hung as a traitor by the British. Yeah, okay. But anyway, here he is. He's age 20. He's already a lieutenant. He was kind of connected. You could kind of jump right to lieutenant if you were from the right family, and he was. So, lieutenant, age 20, he says, first of all, I'm at Dupree's, and this is the same as Mann's, in North Wrentham for breakfast. Let's keep an eye. He had a 2-hour breakfast from 9 to 11. He puts it in his journal. 2 hours. That's fine. He should be refreshed for the day. 2.5 hours marching, less than 3 miles. I calculated it. It's only 3. You could walk that. And he arrives at Hiddens to dine and tarry for 3 hours. Okay? So he had a fairly leisurely trip through Walpole. So, yeah, famous person came through Walpole. All right, now let's look at George Washington. He is going tavern by tavern, just like anyone. He's not overnight at Ames Tavern. He's overnight at Samuel Dexter's house because he was an important person. I'll show you Samuel Dexter's house in just a minute. It still stands. Now, we don't know for a fact he went to Ellis's and Cheney's, but we're pretty sure in Hiddens. You didn't pass a tavern. You needed to get your horses at least refreshed, if not yourself. Zilpha was right near Hiddens Tavern. That's where the story of the water is. Then he comes to North Wrentham, and we know he stayed overnight. In fact, they used to know exactly what room he stayed in, as you might imagine, because the Norfolk people get a real George Washington story. Ours is a drink of water. Theirs is he stays overnight. All right, here's the Samuel Dexter house. Still stands, 699 High Street. Not a museum, it's a private home. So you might think, I've not seen that before. That's because it's a giant fence around it. You're not supposed to see it. So there is, behind that fence, a very historic place where George Washington spent the night. Then you come to Cheney's and Walpole. We've bypassed Norwood, but that's okay. Here we are at Cheney's, and it is a building you might recognize just north of the center of town, now full of doctors' offices and businesses. And if you've ever been in there, there's nothing in there that would resemble an 18th century tavern. So it's not an historic building per se, but it's the location greatly modified of an important tavern at one point. Now, I'm going to relabel this in just a minute because it's a little busy. But this says Southern Post Road, and this says Southern Post Road. And Southern Post Road is what we're going to be on. We're coming through Walpole, but let me make this a little more readable. But I want you to first notice a little jog in the road. See how we're coming down straight, Walpole Center, and then funny little jog? That jog's going to be repeated over and over again. We still have that jog in the road today on Lincoln Road. Now, Charlie Hardy, who used to teach at the high school, some of you know him, redid this map so it's a little more legible. Again, Southern Post Road coming down, we get to the center of town, here's the little weird jog, and now we head into Wrentham, which nowadays is Norfolk. Okay, sorry, I have to keep saying that over and over because you're trying to orient yourself. Norfolk is a relatively new town. All right? Why did they make this little funny jog? Because of something called Great Cedar Swamp. Now, this is an 1832 map. So by 1832, they're like, we're just going to go through the swamp. Right straight through Great Cedar Swamp, which is why today, if you go all the way down Route 1A, south of the center of town, there's wetlands on either side of you. Don't tell me there aren't. Right? There's been a lot of filling there on either side, but you're going down a causeway through the middle of Cedar Swamp. Back in the 1770s, they didn't go plowing through swamps. They went around. Here they are going around. See this little jog here? That's Lincoln Road. Here they are avoiding the swamp. By the time we get to 1832, they're like, nah, we're going straight through. So today, of course, we're going straight through. But that's not the post road. That's not the original post road down there. Lincoln Road is. All right, so let's get back to George Washington. He's going 15 miles, which is plenty. Here he comes. And by the way, that road there that the reenactors are on is probably a whole lot better than what he was walking on. Certainly looks wide enough. Let's check Zilpha's family connections one more time here. Here's Zilpha. Her father was in the war, and her grandfather was one of the inspectors in town. The older men in town tended to be the inspectors. And meanwhile, Royal Smith, Zilpha's future husband, was growing up in Walpole, and he himself, once he got to the right age, served in the war. So did his father, and so did his grandfather. And Zilpha knew him pretty well at the time that she allegedly gave a drink of water to George Washington. So she was at Royal's house that day. They were ages 18 and 15. She was a little older than he was. They weren't married yet, but it's only a town of 600 people. They knew each other. They're probably even distantly related. It'd be kind of unavoidable. All right, and Royal couldn't wait to serve. He had to wait till he was 19, and he served in Rhode Island. At that time, he was just a little too young. And Zilpha's house is on Lincoln Street, right there. Now, this is 1832. By then, she had married Royal Smith, and it was her house, and Royal had actually died, so it's called the Zilpha Smith House, but it was originally the Royal Smith House. All right, again, the little zigzag that tells you you're on Lincoln Road. And just to emphasize it, I'm circling her house, because that's where she was when this happened. And it is just down the street from Hidden's Tavern. Now, this is 1852. All that's in the past, but I can tell you that there's the Smith House and there's Hidden Tavern. I mean, it's like a 3-minute walk from one to the other, okay? You're probably wondering, can we see any of this today? Believe me, I'll be showing you. All right, but I just kind of work on this a little bit further because I want to really prove the point. We're all the way to 1888. By then, the Wares own this Hidden Tavern. It's no longer a tavern, and the Clarks own the Zilpha Smith House. So the original owners are long gone by the time we get to 1888. But this is one of the original roads in town, Lincoln Road, and some of the houses on it are really some of the original houses. Why am I belaboring all this? Well, I belabor everything. I really do. Can you tell? So what we know is that the Zilpha and Royal Smith House was still standing in 1925. By then it was owned by the Bradfords. The Bradfords were from Boston. This was their summer place. And we know because there was a little change to Lincoln Road in 1932 where they had to label each person's house. We know here is the Zilpha Smith House right here, labeled Elizabeth Bradford. Let me just have a little drink of water. All right. Because believe me, I wanted to know where this house is. And here is a 1933 assessor's map showing you Elizabeth Bradford's huge property. If you know your Lincoln Road property shapes, you might think this looks a little bit familiar because there are some still large properties on Lincoln Road. I know Al Getz recognizes it. He's in the audience. Part of it is the Walpole Sportsman's Club. Walpole Sportsman's Club purchased the upper part of the Bradford property, where they still are today. The bottom part is being developed, I think. And as recent as 1967, that's the house. That's the Zilpha Smith House. It burned down, maybe mysteriously, in 1969. By then, it was kind of in decrepit shape. It was being rented out to people. Can't tell you exactly how that all happened, but by 1969, it was gone. 533 Lincoln Road. There's Hidden's Tavern. It's a private house, 492 Lincoln Road. All right, so I'm not going to show you all the stuff about that because it's a residence, it's not a museum. But so we've shown that Zilpha Boyden probably knew Washington was coming along because her own relatives and future in-laws were also leaving Boston on the same road. And DeLue says along the way, they were probably being acclaimed by townspeople. Can you imagine? They're heading victorious out of Boston. People are probably lining the streets as best they can in a little town with 600 people. And Zilpha was likely at the Smith House just down the street from Hidden's because she knew they were coming down that road. That's the only road to come down. There aren't any other roads to come down. Now, we have an additional bit of information that I can give you about this, about Preston Farrington, who was a storyteller. And he had some stories to tell about his indirect experience with this that I needed to sort out a little bit. I think this is sort of the icing on the cake here that we've got Preston Farrington of Norfolk telling stories. This is important, though. My husband helped me design this slide. Here's Zilpha Boyden Smith. Here's Willard DeLue. They do not overlap. They do not know each other. They do not meet each other. Here's Preston Farrington. He's the bridge between the two of them. When he was about 10 years old, He lived at Zilpha Smith's house on Lincoln Road, and Zilpha Smith used to tell the story of how I gave a drink of water to Washington. Yeah, now, I want you to stop and think, because some of you know my son Samuel Obar. Sam said to me, Mom, are you really going to prove that she did it? I'm saying, Sam, if you were going to make up a tall tale about George Washington, would it be a drink of water? It would be, he came into the house, we gave him lunch, he held and kissed the baby, he bonded with the family dog. At the very least, he stayed overnight, if we could possibly have him stay overnight. Apparently, there are enough days in Washington's lifetime to stay overnight, all the places he supposedly was. But it's such a moderate thing to say. It rings true. So we have two storytellers here. We have Zilpha and we have Preston Farrington, and then Willard DeLue gets to hear the story from Preston when he's an old person. And here's what Preston Farrington would say. This is all written down at the Norfolk Historical Society. He himself was in the Civil War. He often recounted his story of Tipka's well. He didn't spell it correctly. It's Zilpha. He said the well was across the street, and it was used with a large sweep. He said it was sometime in 1775. He was wrong. It was 1776, but that's okay. He said George Washington was on his way to spend the night at Josiah Ware's Tavern. True. He said there are many Tories on the road, so George Washington wanted a safe route through Walpole. That might turn out to be not true. And then once they got to Norfolk, George Washington slept inside, and the troops slept outside, and they used to know what room he stayed in. It has a ring of truth. Okay? Now, here's where the well was. This is across the street from where the Zilpha Smith house was. And certain neighbors I've talked with that I know have said, yeah, there's a well in this yard, and it used to be a well that you could see fairly well. It happens not today to be really exposed, but it would be a well something like this. Now, this is my family home in Rehoboth, Massachusetts. I'm not from Walpole, I'm from Rehoboth, and this was built in 1746. This picture is from the late 19th century, some of my ancestors. Here's the kind of well sweep that was in that yard that was used by Zilpha Boyden Smith and everyone else to lift up water. Well, a well sweep was one of the fulcrum methods of getting water up from a well. So you had a great long pole with a rope on it going down into the well. So she used a well sweep to dip up some water. This was across the street. What was it doing across the street? You dug the well where you could dig it. So if it was across the street, you went across the street for your water. Were there Tories on the road? I looked into this because it's a good story. That's what Preston Farrington said. There's Michael LePage again playing a Tory. And the answer to it turns out to be probably not. There were actually a choice of 3 post roads that George Washington could have taken. Here's the southern one that goes down through Walpole. Here's the middle one that goes down through Mendon and Uxbridge and Douglas and Bolton. And then here's the upper post road that goes along to Worcester and Palmer and Springfield and drops down. As far as we can determine, there were no Tories along here. For some other reason, this was the post road that was chosen to get down into the New York area. But I couldn't demonstrate that there were really Tories along the road, as Preston Farrington seemed to think. All right, we get to Josiah Ware's Tavern, corner of Main and Rockwood. It was on the Register of Historic Places. It means it must still be there, right? Here's what it would look like, perhaps. This is 19th century. Here's where it would be. So here's the Norfolk Public Library. Here are those rotaries they put in recently, if you know where I'm talking about. Here where this bank is, that's where the tavern would be. It was torn down in 1981 after it was put on the Register of Historic Places. So that is not a protection unto itself. It should be, but it isn't. So they no longer have it. And they used to know exactly what room George Washington stayed in. And here's a little historic map of downtown Norfolk. It would be approximately where number 8 is, but number 8 does not represent that tavern. And again, see the library, see the 2 rotaries. So that's too bad that happened. 2 digressions before the end. Thousands of French soldiers marched through Walpole to Newport. All I can say as a Francophile is, Wow, they were speaking French. They were coming along through Walpole by the thousands. It must have been just absolutely a delightful thing to see. Eventually arriving to Yorktown, they were coming to kind of save the day for us, which they did, coming through Walpole. And there's actually reenactors that do this. And here's my little pet peeve. They came down West Street and not Lincoln Road. They did not go down Lincoln Road. They were supposed to go down Lincoln Road. So they actually reenact the march down to save the day in Yorktown. And, well, okay, and here are some of the reenactors in Newport. They stopped in Newport. All right, here's a tavern that still stands. Did the Marquis de Lafayette stay there? Did George Washington stay there? Is it on a post road? This is my last digression before the end. Well, it's the Lafayette House in Foxborough. And I can tell you the short story is Lafayette did go there very briefly. Lafayette was on a whirlwind tour of the area in 1824. He went tavern to tavern to tavern. People were dying to have him linger and stay. Little sip of water here, a little sip of water there, maybe a little bit of food. He was on his way from Connecticut up to Boston where he was going to spend the night. So yes, he briefly stayed there, and he probably also briefly stayed in South Walpole, very briefly, like minutes, as he headed along. Not Washington. The bracket, the dates for where Washington was at any given particular point don't work for the Lafayette House, so even though they might say it on their website, that's not true. Notice when it was built, 1784. Used to be called the Everett Inn. So we get to my last question. Is it on a post road? Oh, by the way, nothing inside of it looks like 18th century. However, it's still very nice. I recommend it, but it's just not going to be, the fireplace is all wrong. All right, I just want to point out something. Really important taverns don't have to be on a post road. Lafayette House is a good example. It's on the corner of 115 into 140, and this was a very important route to get from the Norfolk area and beyond down into the Foxborough area and beyond. Of course you would have the Lafayette House there, and it wouldn't have to be on a post road. So the take-home story is there. Yes, there are taverns on post roads, but there are also taverns on other important crossroads that are going from town to town. So Lafayette House, worth visiting, not on a post road. Doesn't matter how close Washington Street is. It's the wrong date, but it's probably more like it was along Route 115 and 140. All right, so I just gave you a lot of information, and that's the end.
Thank you. It was a marvelous presentation, and it was fascinating. I have a doctor's appointment,
okay.
but I enjoyed it
Good,
tremendously.
good.
I
I'm
want
glad
you
I
to know
stopped
that.
more or less
No,
on
no,
time.
but I enjoyed it. It was your knowledge is incredible.
Thank you.
And that's why I didn't even want to leave, but
Okay.
I got to run.
All right,
but
go.
thank you so much. I
Yes, yes,
enjoyed
yes.
it, really.
All right, who has questions?
Could you orient me? What direction were they going to Boston, or were they coming from Boston, returning to the south?
You mean the French or George Washington?
George Washington.
George was coming south. He was done with the evacuation day, done with Boston, need to head down. Yeah. Then to New York, yeah. Yes, other questions?
Now is the, according to the map you showed on the screen, at the end of Post Road, also Pleasant Street, there was a Polly Tavern.
Right.
Is that related to Polly Street, which is on one side of George Park?
So he's wondering if the Polly Tavern is the same family as Polly Street. I don't know, but in a small town like Walpole, it's a good guess. Even though Polly Street is not anywhere near the tavern, it's a good guess, though. Yeah. Yes. What is your question?
I was just going to say that when George Washington was going through Boston, he stopped in Hyde Park and he stayed at the Ray Building.
Yeah.
And at the time, where I lived, there was a barn, and it was stated that George Washington's horses stayed in the barn.
Really? This is Hyde Park. Okay, so and is that barn in Hyde Park still there where George Washington's?
I went down when
Oh.
I was in high school. Someone in the neighborhood was in there, and they set up
Yeah.
playing with matches. And
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, good. Thanks.